spirit of that music. The candidate that's chosen is a person who's poured something unique into the American music community at large, but especially in our area. Randy does woodwork. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but Randy does woodwork, and he does it remarkably well, believe it or not, just remarkably well. Georgia's master luthier reckons there might be as many as 3,000 of his handcrafted instruments, and those instruments are in the hands of some of the best musicians in the world. Believe me, I've seen them in those hands. When I was asked to do this, I made a point to call some of my friends who've been enjoying Randy's work for many, many years. Some of them are famous and some of them are pretty infamous. And he knows some of the ones I'm talking about that are a little infamous. Along with hard work and honesty, the word every single person that I spoke with used to describe Randy was humble. And it's hard to get a consensus, especially among musicians whose egos are usually just huge. And when they use that word, they don't use it lightly. Humility, when you get to Randy's level of fame and prominence, is very, very rare. Especially given his long-standing reputation as a master craftsman and a man who built and repaired guitars for people like Elvis and Johnny Cash and Eric Clapton. It'd be assumed that receiving compliments from true musical legends like this might have some effect and cause an ego to just grow out of control. But Randy seems to appreciate the praise without dwelling on it too much, and that's rare. That says a lot about the man. In the Army, Randy was stationed in Hawaii and he ran the base wood shop. Early 1960s, folk music revival was in full swing, so he built himself an auto harp. Really? An auto harp. And he started playing a few tunes. Soldier's favorite local band was an R&B band called the Swamp Men. And when Randy came back home, he and his twin brother started their own group, decided to call themselves the Swamp Men. And from what I understand, you were briefly the biggest sensation to come out of Brunswick, Georgia. Is that right? It was at that point Randy began his obsession with bluegrass music, and an obsession I think is genuinely what it was. He started making frequent trips to Atlanta because that's where the musicians were, and eventually he and Irene moved up there, and he got a job drafting pipelines for a sewage treatment facility. That was glamorous work, wasn't it? At a picking party, he met this dobro player, a guy that some of you people may have heard of, named Tut Taylor. And Tut was actually painting signs at that time, and he lived an hour away, very close to where I'm from, in a town called Milledgeville, right in the middle of the state. The two shared an interest in vintage acoustic instruments and became fast friends. Back then, they were just instruments. They weren't vintage. They were just old stuff back then. When Tut mentioned to Randy that he had a wood shop, Randy, with Tut's help, found a job there in Milledgeville and moved his newly started family, I believe, down to Milledgeville. I think your child was 6 months old then. And after they were done with work, Randy and Tut would stay in the wood shop till 10, 11 o'clock at night, working on handcrafted banjo necks. And they sold those banjo necks at a lot of events here in the South. It was in Milledgeville that you actually built your first mandolin, that famous F5, that I believe wound up in the hands of Bill Monroe at some point later on down the road. He began to do more and more repair work, a little bit more than he could handle. And Randy, in his own words, has always been very self-critical. And he thought that he was bad when he built that first one, and it wasn't very accurate. But you know what? It was a lot better than what's coming off some of the production lines today. He finally gave up drafting and moved his instrument business to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, God's country. He was working with Rob Yarborough, who was Bill Monroe's banjo player at the time, and opened up a place near the Fame Studios there in Muscle Shoals. Randy's legend had grown, and players from far and wide began to seek him out. One of the regular visitors to his place was Hank Williams Jr. I wasn't allowed. I wasn't able to talk to Hank Jr., but I did talk to one of his guitar players. And I asked him about him showing up with a back seat full of rare instruments down in Muscle Shoals, and he said, oh yeah. And Hank Jr. talks about that to this day. And his band leader is a good friend of mine, a guy named Jimmy Hall out of Macon, actually out of Mobile via Macon. And Jimmy started a band called Wet Willie back in 1969, and Jimmy's a huge fan too. And I was able to talk to Jimmy before I came up here and did this. 1969, when Randy was 26, he had just finished making his first mandolin, and he was traveling with Bill Monroe. You know what? That on a resume alone is very impressive. Bill had seen the first mandolin he made and he liked it, and Randy saw to it later on that he'd have one. A year later, he co-founded the retail and repair shop GTR in Nashville with George Gruen and Tut Taylor. They formed a successful working relationship which allowed GTR to evolve into Gruen guitars, and it was, and in my opinion, still is the most prominent guitar shop in the world. GTR was Nashville's first vintage instrument store, and I think it was probably the first such establishment in the United States, which is something to be said. Keeping that heritage alive was important to them, and it still is today. Everyone in the music business either shopped at GTR or came by to hang out. And of course, when you share an alleyway with the Ryman Auditorium, you get some characters that just float in and out of there. And when Johnny Cash is filming his show there on Thursday nights, before and after the rehearsals Monday through Wednesday, Johnny's guests would usually find their way over and sit and hang out with these guys. Eric Clapton was appearing on the show, and this is right after Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs came out with Derek and the Dominoes, and he and my friend Bobby Whitlock came into that store, and they were like kids in a candy store. Neil Young also came to visit while he was doing tracks for his Harvest album in Nashville. 1972, with their new partner, Grant Boatwright, Randy and Tut moved their business a few blocks over, had an attached performance space, walls lined with acoustic guitars, mandolins, and fiddles, and the old-time picking parlor soon became the go-to spot for musicians and friends alike. In time, the performance space was expanded. Twice a week featured the best performance acoustic artists in the world. People like John Prine used to just kind of stop by and hang out and pick there. That would have been absolutely incredible to witness. Michael Martin Murphy, Emmylou Harris, Norman Blake, Townes Van Zandt, John Hartford, Guy Clark, Clarence White, Larry John Wilson, Sam Bush, Ricky Skaggs, Vassar Clements, Billy Gibbons, regular customers of this guy. Keith Richards and Eric Clapton on his instruments. The Eagles always dropped by when they were in town. Elvis Presley, of course, that famous Elvis inlay. This gentleman right here to my left did that. Sharon White. Ricky said she still plays that guitar. First guitar he ever built now belongs to Sharon White. Of course, you guys might know her as Mrs. Ricky Skaggs. She still plays that guitar to this day. Nashville's hours were long and the business was intense, so in the late 70s, Randy and Irene came back home. He kept a small wood shop in his two-car garage and took on repair jobs for regular customers. They started referring him to other musicians for repair work, to make custom instruments. Randy was building a business without even trying, I think. 1999, his venture had grown too large to operate out of his garage, so he bought a piece of land over in Bloomingdale, set up shop, and built a house next door. Though Randy's made instruments for some of the biggest stars, most of his customers are not professional musicians. They're people like me and you. His main bread and butter comes from weekend musicians. Because you know what, we got jobs. We can pay them. Each instrument needs a player, and Randy's found a room to showcase that. Next to his studio, he's built Randy Wood's Picking Parlor. Little concert hall, seats 100 people, rotating cast of bluegrass bands, and of course the barbecue restaurant next door. Is also nice to have there. And people from all over the world grace the doors of his place, whether it be the guitar shop or the Picking Parlor. And it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce Mr. Randy Wood.
don't really know what to say. I'm not much of a talker. I believe he's already said everything about me, but I do appreciate the honor. It's more than I ever dreamed of doing when I started out in this business. I was just like everybody else trying to make a living. And fortunately, the good friends and customers, we don't have customers, they're all good friends of ours. And my wife, Irene, has been good enough over the years to put up with me and let me do most of the stuff I wanted to do. So she's been the driving force behind almost everything. But I do appreciate the coming down here today, and it's more than I ever expected. But I want to thank everybody here, and especially thank you and Michaelin. I think she was the instigator in this fiasco. I do appreciate it.